Hello, everyone. Welcome to our July conversation for our Social Change Career Series. I'm Tanera Bailey, President and CEO of the SysG Group. We're joined today by Emily Barnes, who's the Assistant Director of Advancement at the Stephen Gaynor School, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about her career journey. If you're joining in the audience, feel free at any time to type in any questions you may have for Emily into the chat box, and I'll try to integrate them into our conversation. I'm also joined by two members of our team. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about where they're located. So Ginny, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am Virginia Gary. I go by Ginny. I am a SysG Group intern and also a graduating Master of Social Work student from the University of Southern California. I'm in my final semester. Graduating in August, and I am located in Miami, Florida.
Great. Thanks, Ginny. And Andrea?
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Cohen. I'm also an MSW intern with the SysG Group, graduating from USC in August. And my focus area is leadership and the Community Leadership Academy run by the SysG Group.
Great. So again, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to type them in the chat box. But we're going to go ahead and get started by having Emily. Why don't you just introduce us to Emily Barnes?
Oh, okay. My name is Emily Barnes. I'm currently the Assistant Director of Advancement at a school in New York City. We cater to educating children with learning differences. My background has I think uniquely for someone, always been in the development field. I think most people don't say, I want to grow up and be a fundraiser, but that is exactly what happened to me. I was a journalism undergrad and majored in journalism and minored in women's studies. And when I graduated, wasn't really sure that that was the path for me necessarily. But I took a work study position my senior year of college in my university's alumni relations and communications department and learned very firsthand and very quickly about the world of development and really enjoyed it. I found that I was using my communication skills. I was interacting with all different kinds of people and going to events and learning about event planning. And it was something that I didn't even know existed as a career. But when I graduated and started looking for jobs, thought, hey, you know what, I'll look around for development. And lo and behold, landed a job in New York, working for a school where I really, I think, got to learn firsthand the ins and outs of development, fundraising, the nonprofit world. From there, I went on to get my master's in nonprofit management, and then did my capstone program, again, bringing it back to journalism, around the project of domestic violence in the media and how domestic violence is portrayed in the media. And that area for me was really interesting. I'd always had an interest in women's rights. Knew that at some point I kind of wanted to work in that field, but doing that capstone really solidified that for me. My husband got into a PhD program in Madison, Wisconsin, and so I had the opportunity to move to a different state, a different environment, and also had the opportunity to take kind of what I thought at the time and what turned out to be my dream job, working in development for a domestic violence organization, and stayed there for 7 years, where we grew the program, went through a capital campaign, and then recently have returned to New York, which I'm really excited about, back into a school environment. So that's, in short, kind of my career path and history, but really trying, it has woven together my journalism background, my communications background in a way that I didn't really know was possible when I was going through school.
That's funny. The first job that I also had out of undergrad was as a special events manager for a nonprofit. And I joke with the interns all the time about how much I hate development. It is the worst part of being an ED in my eyes. It's the one part that forces me to keep consulting and not going back to truly being an ED in some ways. And it's also one of the great ways that most organizations have a need for development. It's a skill that you can always use. And so it's this challenge of balancing that. You have the exact opposite, which I think is so great about this career series, is that you can really share the love of this role within an organization. What is it about the development role that you really enjoy and that you like?
Oh, that's a great question. I really love connecting with other people, finding that shared value that we may have, that shared passion area, and then hoping to demonstrate to them the mission of the place where I work, where we would hopefully, get their donation, convincing them that their passion would really support the organization. That's that moment where that connection happens, where people can see how their donation would make a difference to the organization, is what makes it worth it. And I think that is something that people don't often think about when they go into fundraising. I mean, I think fundraising can be very much like goal-oriented. We need to meet our goal. It's stressful, but there are these really wonderful relationship building moments where you get to know somebody, you get to know what they care about, their family, their history, and then helping them, whatever the donation size may be, make a lasting impact, leave a legacy at that organization to do something better in the world. And that's really special.
Right. Helping people to connect the dots. So like, I'm really interested in human rights. I'm really interested in justice, and I want to support that. And I can't maybe donate my time or my talent in any way, but I do have some financial resources. And for many organizations, it's the way that they keep the motor running. They keep the world spinning. And so it's crucial to their mission. Yeah. One of the kind of top questions or things I hear from our interns when they are interviewing is, one of my goals is I want to learn how to grant write. And, grant writing is like, people feel like if I could just write a grant, money will fall from the sky. We both know that like, that's completely the opposite of what really happens. I love that you mentioned this piece of relationship building. So when you think about the role of development within an organization, what place does this like knowledge about writing a grant sit? And what is it that really shifts the financial resources for the organization? How do you generate revenue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that grant writing is super important, but any piece of communication is really important in development. So being able to write clearly and effectively, whether it be a proposal or branding materials or an appeal, but also in one-on-one communications, clearly communicating the mission of the organization, the need, and how those dollars will actually make an impact. I think for grant writing, I will qualify this by saying that my background is primarily in foundation grants and not government grants. And there is a huge difference in securing those grants. But I think that on the foundation side, there's so much room for that relationship building piece. I think people shouldn't be afraid to pick up the phone and call the program officer, invite them for a tour, ask what they're looking to fund, try and build that relationship, because that will go a long way when you actually sit down to write the grant. And then I think it's also just really looking at the questions and answering the questions concisely. And a key thing that I learned from a previous boss that will stick with me forever is don't try and write a grant for a program you don't have. Make sure that you are not stretching to write a grant for something that you can't fulfill. Now, it's one thing if you want to try and get funding for a new program and you have a plan and you know how that's going to work. But don't try and retrofit yourself into a grant proposal if that's not just to get the funds, because it won't come through in your application, and you'll be in a really tricky situation if you get the funding and can't fulfill that. So I think like really looking at the questions, at the guidelines, picking up the phone and having a phone call, those are all really important pieces that I think sometimes you don't think about when you think about grant writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too often, and I like that you clarified that difference between like government and foundation, because I think government is about transparency and like fitting the checkbox and meeting the numbers of answers so that there's no bias and discrimination. So writing and just like articulating is core. But I think with that foundation piece, your point about relationships is so undervalued, and I think that piece is so important.
Yeah.
So grant writing is just one aspect of the work that someone does in development. We always joke there's no such thing as a typical day in the nonprofit sector, but if you had to kind of summarize some of the typical activities that you do either on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, what do they look like? What are they?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's that relationship building piece. There's the meeting with the donors, there's calling the donors, there's emailing, staying in constant communication, whether that be making introductions or following up on the progress of something that they funded. So there's that donor communication piece always. I often say that I was one of those people that hated math. Thought that I would never use it, that it was just useless to me in the career world. And I was really, really mistaken when I started in the field of development to learn that I use math every day. So my coworker actually jokes that I'm always clicking away on the calculator. But I think that there's a lot of calculating benchmarks, looking at data, projecting. Where are we going to be? Where do we need to grow? There's a lot of math and data work that I don't think is something that people necessarily think about when they think about being a development officer. And then I think the third piece is that strategy. And so thinking about the future, looking at strategic goals for the organization and thinking about how can development support this? Or how can we use pieces of the strategic goal and plan to attract donors or to make our case? So I think that there's a lot of strategy involved in doing development work that's behind the scenes, whether it's strategy of building a plan with those benchmarks and the data, or doing donor research and figuring out what's your gift scale, who are you going to ask, and how are we going to do that? There's a lot of time actually sitting at the desk, not talking to somebody, but doing a lot of thinking. But that balance is so important. You have to be able to do that desk work, but then also be able to communicate and meet with people and make them feel engaged in the mission.
Other than that short stint as a special events person, I've always been on the program side, directly or indirectly managing programs. And that directly connects to your ability to talk about the work that we do, to be able to share and move the funding cycle forward. How can program-based staff who are like me hate the development piece? I don't want to write your grant. I don't want to do those things. I don't want to build the relationship necessarily with the funder, but you're reliant on me to be able to get the funding in the door. How do you best work with the program staff, and how can the program staff support you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways. I think one of the great things about being in the development field is that you get an opportunity to immerse yourself in the culture of the organization, in the mission. You get to learn so much. I know whenever I start a new position that I take time and I just read about all the programs, the history of the organization, and then try as much as I can to shadow program staff if that's appropriate. Obviously, sometimes where I worked before at a domestic violence organization, there's client confidentiality, and you can't always do that. But sitting down and meeting with program staff, getting their stories, that is the piece that is going to speak to donors. What the day-to-day on the ground work is what is going to be the most compelling. I could sit down with somebody and give them a sheet of statistics and say, we do really great work. You should give us a donation. But if I come in with a story of how our organization is making a difference in somebody's lives, that is way more compelling. I think for program staff, just being open to share those stories. It's not something that I think people who are doing direct service are so immersed, and they should be, in the work that they're doing with the clients. And it goes the same for teachers, so immersed in making sure that their students have what they need, that they're not always thinking about what are my success stories that I can share. Where I worked before, we actually encouraged people to write those down. And we kept a folder on our shared drive, and we were like, please write your success stories down. We will use, and we did, we use them all the time. And I think that's really, it's something that's somewhat simple to do, but really so helpful to the development office as well. I know that there was, like, a couple years ago, there was a article about the culture of philanthropy, and that really kind of took off, that organizations should really embrace this culture of philanthropy and encouraging their staff to be involved in building the development infrastructure of the organization. I think part of me agrees with that, and part of me sees the challenges with that. But I think the truth to all of that, and the most relatable piece, is that donors do want to know what's happening on the ground. And the organization can do a much better job of telling a compelling story if they have those day-to-day client aspects to share.
Yeah. I'm sure in the shadowing, you also, it will allow you to kind of trigger when the donor asks a particular question, or if you're trying to give them an example, it's not just this, like, okay, so tell me what happened. You like see the change, or you see the happiness or the response that happens based upon the service that the organization has had.
Yeah. And sorry.
No.
And I think that there's also sometimes maybe a feeling that it has to be a story with a happy ending, or it has to be a story without a happy ending to show the need. But I think that either one in a particular situation can work. It's really about having those nuggets that then you can use depending on who you're meeting with and their interest area. And I mean, I know, we often had a lot of stories for domestic violence survivors that we didn't know the ending to the story. We really didn't know. But we knew that we made a difference in one snapshot of time, and we were able to tell that story. And we were able to make the case of, this is why you should support us, because we can do X, Y, and Z. We don't know the future, and nobody does, but here's this one little snapshot in time that we can tell you about.
Absolutely. Sometimes, particularly like when you've worked in the field for as long as you have, when you say, just speak to a donor, that sounds really simple because you do it all the time. But for people who are new to this space, that in and of itself sounds very intimidating. Somebody in the audience asks, kind of, can you describe an experience, particularly maybe with a new donor? When you're talking about a program's progress, what are you saying? How are you engaging? How do you make that conversation worthwhile?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think, as silly and cliche as it sounds, be yourself. Donors are just like the rest of us in many ways. They are talking to you or interested because they care about the mission of your organization, and they truly do want to know. I think sharing what you do on a day-to-day basis within appropriate, confidentiality restraints is great. Sharing a snapshot of your day, a client story. I think, we used to always say to program staff, you don't need to know the answers to all the financial questions. You don't need to know what percentage of our funding comes from fundraising and grant support. You can just say, let me introduce you to our executive director. But the most valuable piece that you can share is the day-to-day. And I think that when donors get to meet program staff, that's so special. They're seeing their dollars at work. Because the reality is that, most organizations need fundraising dollars for their operating budget. And the operating budget pays program staff in most situations. And so just seeing how organizations hire these really outstanding, expert in their field staff members that are carrying out their work can be really impactful.
Absolutely. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So, Ginny, Andrea, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask Emily?
I'm sure.
Okay, go ahead.
So, Emily, I actually have fundraising and development experience. I worked for United Way as a senior development officer for 4 years. And since we're on the topic of donors, United Way has already those connections in the community, but I'm wondering for maybe other nonprofits who are not as well known and maybe smaller, how do you go about the process of finding your donors?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I think it really depends on each organization. So when I worked for the domestic violence organization, so much of my work there was community outwardly focused. So it was taking a look who was already in our donor database, but also hosting a lot of events. We really tried to be out in the community as much as possible in accessible ways. And what we found was that when we hosted different events or different opportunities for our executive director to speak or what have you, that people came. And most often, I would say with that organization, they came because they had a reason to care about that cause. There was something there that they felt it was a problem in the community. They had a loved one who was affected. They cared about women's rights, whatever that may be. And I think it kind of grew from there. So people came to an event, they brought their friends, they became donors, they introduced us to other people. But it was certainly part of my role and the role of my team to be out in the community as much as possible. So going to different networking events or, really trying to, we used our board and our volunteers so much to do that. So we really asked our board members and our fundraising volunteers to introduce us to people. Especially with organizations, social service organizations that are really trying to make sure that their issue is part of the ongoing dialogue in the community. Having people introduce you to somebody else, especially like in the corporate world or in a foundation, goes a long way because they're getting so many requests from so many different nonprofits. So I think that's one way of doing it. In the education world, it's a little bit different because your constituency is kind of built in. So you have the parents of the school, you have alumni, you have grandparents, you have former parents. They're all invested in the school because they've already felt the impact. And I think that is a little bit more of an internal focus of who your donors are. They are already eager to give because hopefully they have had a really wonderful experience. They have fond memories. They want to give back. So I think it is partly what the mission of the organization is, and partly just being willing to go out there and talk about it as much as you possibly can too.
Very great tips. Thank you.
Andrea, did you have any, or Ginny, did you have another question? Go ahead, Andrea.
I was wondering, because something that makes me the most nervous is sort of asking for the donation.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if, like, when you started, was that an issue for you? And how have you sort of dealt with that?
Oh, yeah. I think, I don't know if that about everybody, but I think most people are nervous about that. Nobody who I've met really loves doing the ask. I mean, there's certain people who really do, but you have to kind of work yourself up to that point where you feel ready to do that. And it's an intimidating thing. I think for me, I definitely had to work myself up to that. And I remember at my very first job, I started by just helping to make annual fund calls. The annual fund director gave me a list and she was like, go ahead, start these calls and see how it goes. And I do that in my job now, and I still get a little bit nervous before I make the call. But I will say that it's, I think 9 times out of 10, it's always a positive experience. Once you start that conversation, the person on the other end of it wants to be having it. And I think if you feel prepared and you fully believe in the mission and the program that you are asking for, it's going to go so much easier, because that's going to come through in the conversation. Because I think, most of the time, unless you're doing some type of fundraising where you're cold calling somebody, the donor's prepared for that conversation too. The donor knows why they're coming in or why they're calling you. And so I always have to remind myself of that, though, because it's always intimidating. And then once you kind of start talking, it flows a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Great
Awesome.
question.
Thank you.
Great question, Andrea, because that is one of the main reasons why I do not like developers that ask. Even to this day, it's still I can tell you all about the work we do. And then when we get to that point where I need to just like pivot, I struggle. So I think Emily's point that like even the seasoned people get nervous with it made me feel a little better too. So thanks for that, Emily.
My heart always pounds before I do it.
Someone from the audience also wanted to know a little bit about time management and donor retention, because I think, again, one of the challenges, particularly for smaller organizations where development is maybe a multi-hat role, maybe not a one-person role, you get this great funding or you have this great event, and then what do we do now? Like we got the money, but we have to do this again a year from now. What can we do to manage our time throughout the year and not lose that donor?
That's a really good question. And I think that's a real struggle, especially if you're at an organization that is event heavy. I think it is so easy to get caught up in the event kind of, that becomes your life. What I do for myself, and obviously everybody is different, but I try and start my fiscal year with a calendar. And I try and break that calendar into what are the main initiatives that I want to accomplish this year? And then how am I going to build in for each of those initiatives? The donor retention piece, the cultivation piece, what stewardship are we going to do? So I try and think about that for every initiative that is set forth for the year. So that's one way that I do it. A lot of people use their database as a tool, setting up when they enter a gift, they'll set up a calendar reminder to check in with the donor at a certain time. That's never worked for me. I know people that is a wonderful tool. For me, I don't know. It never seems like the right time to check in, and I'm always reevaluating. But I think just training yourself to remember that you should try and check in with a donor as frequently as you can without being obnoxious, of course. But when you have an update, send a little note. When it's a quarter has passed, check in. I think there's all different kinds of tools that you can use. For me, just having a yearly plan that I can check in on a quarterly basis to remind myself of, last quarter we had our event. I could send, X, Y, and Z to the sponsors to let them know how their sponsorship helps support our event, things like that I can build into the plan at the start of the year and check back on.
That's great. Either of you have, Ginny or Andrea, any other questions before I continue with mine?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ginny.
I did have one more question. I'm just curious as to the future of fundraising as you see it. At the SysG group, we're primarily a virtual organization, and we use social media a lot to get our word out. And so I'm curious, how are nonprofits utilizing social media, or is social media, last decade and now it's GoFundMe, or are people using apps now? I don't even know. It seems like it's something new every day. I can't keep up.
I think that is really a challenge for every fundraiser, no matter what the size, is to know what is the best way to ask. And I think there are donors that you have ongoing relationships with. And so social media isn't the channel for them. But social media can be super effective in bringing in new donors, or I think even more effective in branding and conveying the message. I think from my perspective, and I am certainly not at all an expert on social media and fundraising, but I think that using social media as a tool for messaging and marketing is stronger than using it as a tool for fundraising. I do think, though, that email appeals can be really effective because you already are reaching out to somebody who is likely connected, likely interested. Maybe they're a volunteer, maybe they are a service user, maybe they're already a donor, and they're, I think, more likely to click than seeing something on social media because they're scrolling and they'll go back to it later, but maybe they don't. So I guess I'm more old-fashioned in that way, that I like the face-to-face or email over social media. But I think social media is so strong when you're trying to do a campaign, a marketing campaign, a branding campaign, to just get the word out about the organization. That can be so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like, It sounds like, you know, that kind of goes with the theme, which is that fundraising piece is all about those personal relationships. Mm-hmm. So how can you connect personally with donors? Okay.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
Just to kind of add on what Jenny asked about the social media piece, but we've also seen this increase in like crowdfunding.
Yeah.
And we were approached by a platform that wanted to talk to us about how we could utilize this, and we barely fundraise, but I could see how that might impact organizations that have maybe had a multi-team development staff, or, you know, organizations like schools where you are doing this kind of internal fundraising where it matters that someone went to school. They're kind of similar to like when you're a kid and they make you sell candy bars from school.
Right.
Those types of fundraising. This is the new candy bar.
Yeah.
Have you seen it change things within the scope of opportunity within development? Because heck, and donors asking donors instead of someone needing to be that middle party. Not maybe with traditional large scale or like major gifts or things like that, but those annual campaigns that used to be run by, you know, just one or two people. Has that maybe changed to like sending out the email to the faculty and to the teachers and to the parents, and now it doesn't need to be a full-time staff person?
I think yes and no. I think it has changed the way that fundraising happens because you, as just an everyday supporter of the organization, can quickly become a fundraising arm of the organization. And there are ways as fundraisers that you can make that super easy for your volunteers and your supporters. You can prepare email templates and toolkits and set things up for those who want to do that. And the reach becomes that much greater. And that's pretty amazing. You know, within seconds, you can reach people all across the world, share your story, and share why this organization is important to you. And I'm a sucker for getting those emails. When my friends or family send them to me, I think this is something that's important to them. I want to support this organization. So I think there's a lot of good in that, in spreading the word, in having that peer-to-peer ask. I think it also happens where, where I currently work at the school, we do a lot. I would say, most of our annual fund is done through peer-to-peer asks. So we have parent volunteers who are asking other parents to support the organization. Same with, universities use that model with their alumni, calling other alumni. There's something about being asked by somebody who shares something with you that is somewhat more compelling than having somebody who's paid to do that job ask you. That said, there is so much work on the back end that I don't know if I necessarily see that replacing somebody's full-time job as a development officer. There's tons of volunteer management that goes into peer-to-peer fundraising models. There's a lot of back-end work into making sure that your platform, whatever you choose to use, is working right, that's readable, accessible, that you can be there to troubleshoot with people. So I still am a proponent of a development officer in supporting kind of these new models of fundraising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like when I was talking about the grant writing, that people feel like it'll magically produce money. Mm-hmm. I think the same is kind of how people view crowdfunding. Oh, well, we're a new nonprofit. We'll just set up a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo and money will pour in. And you have to have a compelling story. All the skills that make development hard didn't change. It's still there.
Well, and I think that the other piece of that is there's so much behind the scenes of accountability and acknowledging donors and making sure that there are good donation tracking systems and that money is being handled appropriately. And those things all live within the development department. So, and that's not something that, can happen or be done well, I don't think, without a development officer.
No, absolutely. And I think also probably the same scrutiny that organizations, now that there is that accessibility, that also means people can find out more about your work and, but also how you use those resources. Mm-hmm. So you had a fundraiser and you raised, millions of dollars. People want to see, well, I want to see change. I want to see the impact of that. Even if I only gave you $1, I want to see what you did with that. And so it's that blessing and a curse where, someone mailed in a check and didn't really know what happened. Now they can kind of see that the measure went up and they know that millions of dollars were done. Right. Expected. So I think I agree that I don't think it's going to change in that way. What are you think some of the key skills someone needs to work in your position? You talked about being able to communicate and could develop relationships, but are there other key things that you think someone needs?
Communication, relationship building. I think being a strategic thinker is pretty important. To be able to see the big picture is an important skill. So, you may not see, especially if you're doing something like a capital campaign, you may not see the results of your work for a few years, but you need to be able to think out a few years ahead to know how you're going to get there. I think being able to feel comfortable talking to people about financial information, whether that be their own or the organization, and being financially transparent about the organization and being able to convey that in a way that's understandable to people, that's clear, that you're not getting in the weeds, because donors don't need to be in the weeds, but they need to be able to know that their investment was worthwhile and is appreciated and is useful. So I would say those are the biggest ones. For me, I think communication is just the biggest one, and being kind of willing to talk to anybody, but also to be a really good listener. I think a development officer should listen more than they talk in a lot of cases. They're going to learn a lot about the donor, a lot about the donor's interests, by just sitting back and saying, tell me about yourself or your path or why you're interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it is about why, and why did you decide, or why us? Like, why do we deserve the resources that you want to give? Yes. And if you're too busy saying, this is what we do, and trying to make a case, but not listening to why they even want to support, you're
Right.
probably not going to get a significant investment in a way that continues. And it's
Yeah.
one of the challenges, and again, to one of the reasons why I've always not necessarily liked the role is the pressure, you know, particularly for organizations who, many nonprofits, we know funding has stayed flat for decades, and the number of nonprofits has quadrupled in the last 20 years. And so it's supremely competitive. We also have these like social ventures entering the space to also make a case for it. And so one of the challenges I've seen either with my clients or with organizations is this kind of all the pressure on the development side to keep the doors open. And, you know, when, you know, the grant doesn't come through or the funding gets cut, this like immense pressure to meet that shortfall.
Yes.
How have you dealt with that in your career? And how do you kind of still stay motivated to do this work? Because I think that, to me, has always been a challenge. I fundamentally get what we do. Like, I'm passionate about it, and it just seems like a no-brainer. And so this challenge and this frustration I feel within the fundraising part, where like I have to make a case for why this is important, is my battle and that pressure. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, the stress part of it can be really challenging. I mean, you start your year or, you know, your career, let's say, with a goal that's always hanging over your head, and people that are always kind of checking in on the progress of that. But I think that, you know, the great thing about the nonprofit field is, I think, how pliable the field really is. So being able to think about, well, things aren't really going the way we projected at the beginning of the year. How can we stop, take a step back, reevaluate? Are we doing things on our end the right way? Or has the market changed? Has there been some type of news story lately that has maybe changed how people are viewing our cause or our issue? I think, you know, there are ways to review constantly and think about how to evolve, how to change, that will hopefully lessen the stress. That's not to say that there isn't always stress. I think that there's always that, you know, stress of, if I don't do X, Y, and Z, if I don't meet my goal, then the organization isn't going to be able to do what it is setting out to do. And that's really stressful. And I think that having somebody who you trust within the organization that you can talk to about is critical. I've been very fortunate that I've had just incredible supervisors that I've been able to go to throughout the process to check in. I'm feeling worried about this goal. It's not going the same way that I thought it would. I don't think this donor is going to give as much as we thought. Being completely honest and using that person who you trust as a sounding board. I think that oftentimes, you know, people get stuck and they operate in a vacuum and they don't tell anybody their worries or their stresses until it's too late. And I think it's really important to have somebody that you trust, that you can use as a sounding board, that you can bounce ideas off of, just for your own mental sanity, but also to think creatively about how to change and how to pivot if needed. It's really, the nonprofit world is also very competitive, and that can be stressful too. I think it's such a wonderful, nurturing world in its way, but it's also, there are only so many dollars available, and there are only so many donors you can meet with in a year. And so that can hang over your head and make it very stressful.
Mm-hmm. And especially in particular pockets of money, right?
Yes.
There's so many donors that give to this cause, and so there's 8 of you doing this. You have to prove that you're better than this one, and or collaborate in ways that are counter mission. It's very, very challenging.
Yeah.
Now that you've been in this field for, a pretty significant amount of time, how do you keep your skills up? What do you do and what do you seek to stay on top of trends, to know what's best practices? You talked about like market shifts and things like that. How do you, what are the resources you look to keep your skills?
My favorite resource is reading the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I just find that to be such a valuable tool. I think they have really good articles. So I enjoy like reading that on a weekly basis, but then they also have like nice resources and tools. I'm try and be part of networking groups. So I've been part of AFP before. And in New York, there's a annual fund director group. Association for Fundraising Professionals, sorry, right. Acronyms. So, trying to meet other professionals in the field. I think, though, quite honestly, talking to my colleagues has often been the greatest resource that I have, whether that be in the program side, the executive director, or other development professionals that I work with. Just being able to, because they know the organization best. So if you're talking about how to problem solve a very specific thing within your field or your organization, I think that that's super valuable, to be able to have people that you trust to think creatively about addressing certain challenges. So that's always been a great resource for me. And I've been very fortunate that I've had a lot of people in my life that have been filling that role for me.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the difference in the types of donors that you're seeking when you were at the domestic abuse organization, and now that you're back in an education environment. What is the difference in the jobs? Is there like key elements that, because both are pretty core, like I think the domestic abuse is pretty traditional development and communications within the nonprofit sector.
Yes.
And then education-based advancement roles are kind of follow a certain look. So what is the big changes, and what is maybe the benefits and the challenges of either?
Well, I do think it goes back to, I think the biggest difference is that internal versus external focus for donors. So I think at a social service organization that's maybe, looking at a social justice issue or a community-based issue, your donor pool can very well be the whole community. Whereas with a school, it's a little bit smaller. There are certainly people who will donate to a school because they believe in the mission, but it may be a more roundabout path to get to them. So I think that that's one of the biggest differences. My specific roles are a bit different in that when I was at the domestic violence organization, I was doing both development and communications. And so my time was split between fundraising and also doing PR and being kind of the deputy spokesperson. So really trying to do branding and development, which certainly go hand in hand, but aren't always in the same position. My position now is just the fundraising. And I think that in some ways, when you talk about the pressure and the stress, that has alleviated some of that because I have one task, I have one focus. We have a very capable, wonderful person who is focused on the communications. And so then I take what she does, I pick and choose what I want to use in my messaging, but I'm focused on the development piece, which is a little bit more, allows me to just kind of tailor those skills and work on that more directly than being spread among kind of different thought trains. Yeah.
You both times, I guess, you moved and have to find a job. So when you're looking for development roles, what kind of keywords are you using? Where are you looking for jobs? And are you relying on your existing network, or are you kind of out, just kind of whatever pops up?
When I moved to Wisconsin, I didn't have an existing network. I was brand new there, didn't know a soul. So that was kind of a more traditional job search where I was online. I used Idealist a lot. And I think eventually that's where I saw the posting. But I also spent a lot of time researching just nonprofits in the area, and then going on their websites to see if they had a position open. And if they didn't, then I would flag them to go back and keep checking for places that I really thought I might be a good fit. So that was more of a traditional job search. When I was looking for that position, that was, 8 or 9 years ago, LinkedIn was not a thing, really. And it wasn't a place where you even looked for jobs. I mean, it probably was, but I didn't know about it because, again, social media is not really my thing. So maybe it was, but when I got this most recent position, I had established networks in New York. So I definitely reached out to them and put my feelers out that we were, thinking of moving back to the city and, just kind of softly looking for things. Ultimately, that's how, I ended up finding the position because I had put those feelers out, but I also did a traditional search as well, just to see what was out there. So I think having a network, if you have a network, it is so great to be able to use that. And I think it doesn't mean asking somebody to give you a job. It just means saying, hey, I'm thinking about making a career move, or I'm thinking about getting into this field. If you ever see anything or know of anybody, please keep me in mind. Because I think you can't underestimate the power of knowing somebody who knows somebody who knows of a position and the timing works out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another speaker has said that like informational interview and just that networking piece, so often it may not be that they're hiring or they're in that particular role, but they just were connected. We know people who do this type of work. And so we'll hear of something will come across our desk because somebody's looking. And so just knowing that there's a person seeking something is a good resource. We're getting close on our time. So if you do have any questions in the audience, if you want to type them, Ginny, Andrea, any final questions for Emily?
Sure. Just kind of going back to that donor retention piece. Yeah. Beyond introducing the donors to the program officers and letting them know through marketing materials the impact of their dollar, what are some other strategies organizations can use, like engaging them in volunteer events or introducing them to recipients? What do you think is most effective as far as linking the dollars back to the work?
All of those. I think for the right person, a volunteer opportunity is so great, is just a way to see on the ground their dollars at work. I think for other people, they might appreciate, we used to do like kids artwork on a note card and send a little note with a little story. That is something that maybe somebody who's not interested in volunteering, but really wants to know what's happening in a very intimate, special kind of way. That's a way to get that information across. I think it all goes back to having those opportunities, if you can, with donors, to know what do they appreciate. And I think most times they'll tell you. Donors usually will say, like, I'd love to volunteer, or I want to be on your board, or I don't like fluff. Don't send me a gift. Don't send me, don't spend your money on me. I want once a year an update on, XYZ program. I think it kind of depends on each donor, but thanking every donor as much as physically possible is never a bad thing. So saying thank you as much as you can, I always do a handwritten note on the formal acknowledgement letter that goes out from the organization, and then try and do other handwritten notes from somebody else within the organization as another touch. I really firmly believe that any dollar that comes through in fundraising is valuable, whether it is $1 or $1 million, because to whoever's giving it, that is a piece of them that they could have given somewhere else, but chose to give to you because they believe in what you're doing, and it's significant. It means something to them to take something that they would have spent on something else, or put in their savings accounts or whatever, and give away to somebody else. So I never think that people can be thanked enough. And I think, you know, donors love to just be in the know. They really do. They feel like they can see the value of what they've done by just getting those updates as frequently as you can. And that, I mean, it totally kind of takes us down to the path that we don't have time, which is like the major donor cultivation and stewardship versus kind of your general donor pool. But I think thanking donors is kind of always the key.
Thanks for that question, Ginny. And we'll definitely be pulling you into other things around development, Emily. So this won't be the final conversation. But if you could give one piece of advice for someone looking for work in your field or for your type of position, what would that one piece of advice be?
I think find an organization, find a field, find a mission that speaks to you, that you believe in. You won't be successful, you won't enjoy it if you are trying to fundraise for an organization for which there's a mission that you don't believe in. And so that's key. I mean, that has always been, for me, makes my job easier, because I truly, when I'm going out to ask for donations, I truly care about the place that I work and can really speak honestly about the impact of that organization. And I think that is really critical. And I think that would be my one piece of advice. Find the place that really speaks to you, that is your passion, that you care about, and the rest will be easy.
Yeah.
Well,
easy besides the hard.
Easier. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. There were so many great takeaways, and I think you've redeemed my negative views over the years to the interns about development work. As much as I try to hide them, not very well. You've, I think, in some ways, inspired some hope in them that this is not all doom and gloom, like I always say.
It's not. It's really. I actually do think it is one of the most hopeful jobs that you can have at a nonprofit. I really do.
Yeah. So, yeah. You definitely have made it less so for me. Like some of the things, like the point about just connecting with the mission is so core. And then even Andrea's point about being nervous about the ask, just knowing that you still get nervous. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm okay. We can get there now. Now that I know that that's just normal.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for your time. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
If you have any questions and you're watching the video, please feel free to type them and we'll send them to Emily on her way. Have a great afternoon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Did it go away? Hold on.